how did Slim use technology to overcome the resource deficiencies in the Burma theatre? We look at military innovation in the air, on the ground, and on the rivers.
This is the Principles of War podcast, professional military education for junior officers and senior NCOs.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the podcast. Today, we're concluding our three-part interview with Dr. Robert Lyman. We're going to be looking at Slim as an innovator. When your theatre has the lowest priority of all of the theatres in a world war, you can rest assured that it's highly unlikely you're going to be getting anywhere near the resources that you need to be able to conduct offensive operations. This was exactly the situation that Slim found himself in 1944 and 45 as he looked to reoccupy Burma. We're going to look at some of the innovations that he used to be able to support his concept of operations, and we're going to discuss his mindset that enabled him to embrace technology. So let's get back to Robert and the story of Field Marshal Sir William Slim. Slim was quite the innovator. He developed a range of innovative tactics, aerial resupply, air evacuation of the wounded, air power in general, the development of his navy, and even the way that road building was done. How much of this was from necessity? How much of it was his natural inclination? And where did he learn this? How did he have the capability to understand what a technology could do and how it could change the conduct of war and enable his army to use that technology to great effect?
That's a great question. Slim was always an innovator. When he was on the Northwest Frontier in 1938 and 39, the big challenge for the Northwest Frontier was how you actually sustained and supported your outposts along the frontier with Afghanistan, this very porous, highly dangerous environment, which was a terrain which was dominated by effectively the enemy. And he came up with the idea of aerial resupply. He came up with the idea of aircraft flying up to rather than sending expeditions along the roads where you had to go through this laborious process of securing the road, securing the high ground, securing the road, and then moving ponderously into enemy territory, use air supply. And this was the first time that the forward posts of the Indian Army were actually resupplied by air. You need to have a bright, intuitive, inquiring mind, and Slim had a bright, intuitive, inquiring mind. So he was also, as I've said, intensely practical. And his entire army, the 14th Army, was entirely practical. Some really good examples of this. So you're right, it was necessity. But if we go back to my point about this 1,000 miles between Calcutta and 1,200 miles even to Tammu, how do you actually solve the problem of getting across the Chindwin? Well, Slim knew that he was never going to get boats from anywhere. He needed to cross the Chindwin and he needed to come up with his own solution. So he sat down with a very small number of men in 14th Army and the Army Command, and they basically workshopped this problem through and came up with the idea of creating their own navy. I mean, you mentioned it, but the size of this navy is really quite astonishing. If I just describe what they did, in order to cross the Chindwin, and in order to be able to navigate through Burma, you needed to control the waterways, the Chindwin and the Irrawaddy being the two most significant, and then the Satang and Salween on the right later on. And Slim knew this because this is what had defeated him in 1942. The Japanese had control of the water. So he initiated this plan to create a navy where the about 40,000 workmen went into the teak forest along the Chindwin, chopped down all the trees, built a boatyard on the Chindwin at a place called Kaliwa, and they built a 10-ton barge that was able to carry a Sherman tank. They built these from green wood, teak, slapped pitch all over them, lots of natural oil pouring out of the ground in this part of Burma in order to give them some waterproofing, and launched them. They built 550 of these 10-ton barges, enough to be able to get his army, he had two armoured brigades, Shermans and Grant tanks, across the Chindwin and down the Irrawaddy. It's really quite an extraordinary example of logistical chutzpah. And Slim was the man who came up with the idea and executed it. Go and chop the trees down, use elephants, 70 or 80 elephants to bring them, create sawmills where you plank the woods. You've got no one in the army who has ever built a boat before, but you've got lots of smart guys and engineers, and by trial and error, they create these 550 10-ton flat-bottom barges that were dramatically successful. When I first went to Burma in 1999, I was traveling up the Irrawaddy, and the guy who was taking me said, a chap called John Hinchcliffe, he said, see all those teak barges? I said, yeah. He said, they were built by Slim in 1945. End of 1944, early 1945. This is quite extraordinary. They were still in operation many, many years later. So that's an example of a necessity demanding a solution and a practical solution being come up with. Another one was the monsoon. Monsoon is a dramatic challenge to military operations in the Far East. In the northern reaches of Asia, the monsoon runs from May till April, and about 300 inches falls. It's quite an extraordinary amount of rain. In the UK, we get about 30 inches a year. So this is 10 times that amount. And it washed everything away, washed roads away, washed airfields away. So how do you actually create, in the absence of metal or any form of a hard surface on an airfield, how do you actually come up with something that will withstand constant rainfall? And 14th Army came up with, Slim gave them this challenge. They came up with a thing which they called Vitesse, which is effectively long strips of hessian dipped in tar and draped across the airfield in a crisscross pattern. And it proved to be dramatically effective. And so the life of airfields could be extended and made all weather, not fully all weather, but they certainly worked very, very effectively. There are lots of examples of very practical solutions being reached to these quite dramatic challenges, because Slim was ultimately a very, very practical man. He didn't wait to be told a solution by reading it in a book. He came up with it himself. And he, even more importantly, I think, he surrounded himself with people who thought the same way that he did.
What was his approach to the employment of special forces?
Oh, it's a great question. A lot of people accuse Slim of being anti-special forces, and nothing could be further from the truth. And I think people are confused by his opposition to Special Force. Special Force is the name given to Operation Thursdays, Wingate's troops in Operation Thursday in 1944. And they think as a consequence that Special Force were Special Forces. Well, they weren't. He was a very strong advocate of Special Forces so long as they were carried out in conjunction and in support of main force operations. And in this, he was no different to Auchinleck. Claude Auchinleck, famously the original sponsor of the long-range desert group and the Special Air Service in North Africa. He recognized very early on the need for long-range intelligence from Special Force units in Burma, and he promoted V-Force in 1942, which was an organization called a watch and ward organization along the Chindwin, along about 1,000 miles of hills between the Bay of Bengal and the northern Brahmaputra. He sponsored guerrilla operations, the Rohingya guerrilla operations, known at the time as Mohammedan operations, against the Japanese in Arakan in 1942. He supported the establishment of P-Force under Colonel Peacock in Imphal in 1944. And in January 1945, this was really where his sense of how important special forces are really comes to the fore, because in January 1945, he was given direct control of the main Special Operations Group in Southeast Asia, SOE, known out in Southeast Asia as Force 136. And he mobilized Force 136 to raise a militia army amongst the Karen people, the Karen Hills along the Satang River Valley, who took the war to the Japanese in March and April 1945 and enabled Slim's main force operations, the 4th Indian Corps, to get down to Toungoo and push the Japanese out of Rangoon. And this was because Slim understood the power of special forces. He's, as I said at the outset, he's often regarded as being anti-special force because of his opposition to Wingate. But that's also a misnomer. He wasn't anti-Wingate. He wasn't anti-Operation Thursday. He was anti-private armies. And very unfortunately, Wingate exhibited every bad characteristic of a privateer: not listening to advice, not taking instructions, not understanding or wanting to understand the military strategy of the region, nor indeed the grand strategy, and so on. Now, this is what privateers do, and Wingate was the archetypal privateer in the British Army. There were a few of them in the Second World War, but Slim recognized the power of special operations. I mean, a little example of where he thought that Wingate was wrong. Wingate had this idea that that long-range penetration columns could be placed into Burma behind Japanese lines and take the war to the enemy and advance all the way ultimately to Saigon. And he had this idea that conventional forces of the kind represented by the 14th Army would never defeat the Japanese in battle. Unfortunately, he made this prediction at the wrong time, because he made it just when Slim was beginning to defeat the Japanese in northern Arakan and in Imphal, Kohima, in Manipur in 1944 as well. Slim's idea was that actually where Wingate's force was placed along, I think, an area called the railway corridor between Mandalay and Michinau, actually, if Wingate's force of 23,000 troops and 300 aircraft had been moved slightly to the left or slightly to the west and placed on the Chindwin, they would have then proved to be a very significant impediment to General Mutaguchi Renya's invasion of India. It's where you place the troops and what the troops did in achievement of the strategic objective, which was critical to Slim, which is where Wingate went wrong. And I give a lecture every year to the British Army on the strategic effect. And my two examples are Wingate's operations in 1944, Operation Thursday, and Operation Character, which is the Karen levies operations along the Satang River Valley. And the strategic effect of both operations were dramatically different. Operation Thursday achieved very little of strategic importance, whereas Operation Character, this operation led by 2,000 members of Special Operations Executive, raising 14,000 Karen levies, training them in musketry and minor tactics over 3 weeks, and then sending them to a battle against the Japanese, actually was the critical operation that enabled Rangoon to fall. Without the operations of the Karen levies in April 1945, 4th Indian Corps could not have got to Toungoo and pushed the stop out of the bottle. The Japanese in Rangoon then had to evacuate, otherwise they would have been cut off. And that was the effect of special forces. And Slim recognized it. He also recognized that Wingate's instructions were political, and he didn't interfere in them.
So great generals are partially a product of the generals that they oppose. Who did Slim fight, and how did their individual fighting styles interact?
He fought, first of all, against General Aida, who is the commander of the Japanese invading army in Burma in 1942, and he recognized that General Aida was quite a remarkable man. The Japanese generals in the early years of the war, Yamashita and Malaya, of course, in Singapore, and Aida in Burma, were really remarkable maneuverers. They were great operational commanders. They understood the operational level of war, and they were very effective soldiers. In 1944, he fought against General Mutaguchi Renya, who was the commander of the 15th Army who invaded India in Operation Ugo. And in 1945, he fought against General Kimura, who was the newly appointed commander of the Burma Area Army, some 300,000 men. So very significant forces he fought against. And in each of them, he designed tactics around the nature of the enemy. He knew in December 1943 of the Japanese plans to invade India, but he didn't have any of the details. The Japanese didn't commit much to signals traffic. Most of it was on paper. But the Allies knew that the Japanese were intending to come. They eventually invaded India in March 1944 under Mutaguchi Renya. But Slim had to come up with a plan to oppose them. The plan for Imphal and Kohima was remarkable, was essentially withdrawing into the hills to allow the Japanese advancing columns to become overstretched and weakened, at which time the Allies would come at them with artillery and air, the primary war-winning weapons, of course. He knew that Mutaguchi, he suspected rather that Mutaguchi would take quite enormous risks, logistical risks. So Slim's plan was to maximize Mutaguchi's logistical risks. He also suspected that this problem that the Japanese had was seeking battle. The Japanese wanted to fight, which is an extraordinary thing. They would often ignore the operational objective for the benefit of expressing their martial valor in battle. I mean, it's really bizarre, but it's true. This is a fundamental problem with the Japanese in the Second World War, one of the real reasons why they were defeated. Japanese generals wanted to fight rather than to necessarily to seek the operational objective. Let me just give you a really good example of what I mean by this. Japanese commander General Sato, one of the divisional commanders, Japanese army is about the size of a British corps, about 20,000 men, was sent by Mutaguchi to Kohima. Now, Kohima is the main town on the road between the Brahmaputra Valley and Manipur, Imphal, capital of which is Imphal. And the idea is if Kohima was captured, the British would no longer be able to reinforce Manipur by land. But in all of this, Sato ignored the very, very striking reality that 46 miles beyond Kohima, in the Brahmaputra Valley, was probably the largest logistical base, about 100 square miles of stores east of Suez, the largest military base east of Suez. It's really quite extraordinary. This was the stores base that fueled the Hump airlift and which was designed to fuel future Allied operations in Burma. And if Sato had ignored Kohima by masking it and advanced another couple of days into Dimapur, he would have achieved a dramatic victory for Japan without having to fight. Instead, Sato pig-headedly decided that he was going to fight at Kohima because that was his order. So he saw fighting a battle to be more important than securing the operational objective for which that battle was designed. So he definitely didn't understand Sun Tzu and or Clausewitz. Mutaguchi, interestingly enough, recognized the importance of Dimapur, tried to persuade Sato to go down to Dimapur. Sato had a very poor relationship with Mutaguchi and decided not to do it. It's a complicated story. I'm going to be writing about it in a new book this year, but it's a really good example of how the Japanese failed to understand the operational level of war. There's no point fighting battles unless there is an operational objective. That operational objective needs to be deeply grounded in a strategic reality. And it's a strategic reality that the only time the Japanese had any hold on strategic reality was in December 1941 in their invasion of Southeast Asia. Thereafter, they lost all of it. And their defense in the Pacific and the remainder of Southeast Asia was an attritional one. And because of that, they lost.
So following the victories at Kohima and Imphal, Slim goes on to the offensive. One of the tasks that he needs to do is he needs to cross the Irrawaddy River. And so he was required to retrain, because of the fact that the terrain was significantly different, big open plains. The 14th Army was going to fight in a much more conventional combined arms manner, which is something that they had never done before. How did you go through that process of training an entire army so quickly for a completely different type of combat?
It's really remarkable, isn't it? It is an extraordinary thing, this whole 1945 transformation, not just the transformation of the Indian Army, but the transformation of approach and tactics and design. And it happened very, very quickly. The idea to change plan completely occurred in mid-December 1944. Slim had actually sent his first divisions across the Chindwin at a place called Kalemia and Kaliwa, and they were marching on Mandalay when he realized actually that General Kimura was not going to come out of Mandalay and fight him above the Irrawaddy in the Shuebo Valley. Slim was going to have to come up with another plan. Slim by this stage had 2 armored brigades, and these brigades had been training actually in India through 1943 and had been doing training also in the Imphal Plain through the later part of the monsoon in 1944. But these are Indian soldiers who had never known how to drive before, let alone operate tanks, and for the armoured brigade to operate in a combined arms way and to operate in a manoeuvrous fashion, i.e. to manoeuvre in the battlefield, but actually operate at an operational level of war. And the two words manoeuvre are often confused, but I think you get the sense of what I'm trying to say here. I think the reason why it was so successful was Slim had made the decision. It took about a day to make a decision that instead of sending his entire army across into Upper Burma, he would allow one part, the 33rd Corps, to continue on to Mandalay. He would split off the other part, the 4th Indian Corps, put it with it, the main body of his tanks, drive a road through the jungle, through the Kalor Valley down to a place called Gangor, and then to the Irrawaddy River at a place called Pakaku, recently given a good shaking by that terrible earthquake, and cross the Irrawaddy there. Now, that took a day to decide, but his commanders and the entire army accepted it with alacrity. There was no one there saying it can't be done. They created a road at the end of bulldozers in 6 weeks, behind which came the tanks, 300-odd tanks, through the jungle, through the virgin jungle. I mean, the army had a sense of self-belief by this stage that was unbelievable. Where did this come from? Well, it came from a number of things. It came from the fact that these soldiers had been trained so relentlessly. They also knew after, I mentioned this 11 months of training. It's quite extraordinary. Soldiers knew what they were capable of doing The sense of self-help and ingenuity in the army was overwhelming. People just solved problems. They had defeated the Japanese at Imphal and Kohima. The troops that were marching down to the Chindwin walked through piles of rotting corpses. We're talking about 60,000 dead here, maybe 70,000 dead. The Japanese bodies just lay strewn through the jungle. And the 14th Army knew that they had the Japanese on the run. The Japanese were not supermen. They could be quite easily killed. So what you were seeing, and all this sort of came together at a point at the end of 1944, early 1945, where a very professional, well-trained, confident army just went and fought its battles with quite remarkable panache. Now, this point about combined arms warfare is really remarkable. I'm absolutely confident that the 4th Indian Armoured Corps could have been picked up in 1945 and placed lock, stock and barrel in Normandy as part of 21st Army Group, and it would have done brilliantly well, because the sense of manoeuvre, so how do you actually advance against an enemy position? Mektila is a really, really good case in point. Mektila was fixed by air in mid-February 1944. The tanks crossed the Irrawaddy at a place called Pakiku and a little bit further south at Nyangu. They advanced on Mektila using deception. So the Japanese Mektila didn't think they were going to be under attack. The tanks moved all the way around and then moved in against Mektila from the north and from the east with mobile artillery, cab ranks of fighter ground attack aircraft in the air, had Typhoons by this stage, and mobile artillery and also mobile infantry all working together. So enemy positions were identified. They were stomped with artillery. Tanks and infantry would outflank and then attack the positions. Some positions were left for follow-up forces they were masked for follow-up forces to deal with. And this whole complicated process of maneuver in a combined arms sense was perfectly executed in those early months of 1945 without anyone reading a manual. Now, and my argument and Richard Dennis' argument in Victory to Defeat is that a lot of how you should fight in a combined arms sense is intuitive to smart soldiers. It's about integrating your capabilities. Yes, it's about having the right capabilities to achieve what you want to achieve. That might be an offensive penetration or defense against enemy capability. You do need those capabilities, but they need to be thoroughly integrated, and the commander needs to have oversight of all of them in order to be able to move his chess pieces. The chessboard is the perfect analogy for what combined arms maneuver is about. You don't fight your battle using one or two members of the chessboard. You use them all because they're all fighting a combined battle in which the capabilities of each of them, though discrete, are used together. It is a conundrum, actually. I was writing my book on so many years ago. I was asking myself this question: where did this learning come from? It came from smart soldiers solving problems when they occurred.
That's fantastic. The bridging across the Irrawaddy was an incredible engineering feat as well as a masterful surprise, protected by a strong deception plan. How was this conceived and executed?
We're talking about Kaliwa and Kalemia here. It was actually the largest floating bridge of all time. It was over a mile long at one stage. The Chindwin is quite an amazing river. Well, it was conceived in June 1944 when Slim realized that actually he had the Japanese on the run at Imphal and Kohima. What he needed to do was to chase them into Burma. And in order to be able to do that, he needed some way of getting his entire army. We're talking about 600,000 men in total across the Chindwin. It's one of the world's largest rivers. I mean, it's much, much bigger than the Rhine. I've been up the Chindwin a number of times. I visit the Irrawaddy twice a year. I mean, in some places, it's 8 miles wide. How do you get across? Well, it's not just about bridging the river or crossing the river. It's about protecting your bridgeheads, because these are the most vulnerable parts of any bridge crossing. And to be fair to Slim, his advantage at the end of 1944 was that he had no real opposition on the Chindwin. And the Japanese Air Force had also withered away, dwindled away. It had been destroyed catastrophically by the Allies in 1944. And by the time the Battle for Mandalay came up, we were probably talking about Japanese having no more than 40 or 50 fighting aircraft a day. So it was a pretty devastating loss for the Japanese and a really significant advantage for Slim. But he just, in order to get across the river, he prioritized the bringing up from India over this one road from Dimapur to Kohima to Tamu on the Chindwin of the bridging equipment needed to cross the Irrawaddy, the Chindwin rather, and then the Irrawaddy. Everything else was going to be undertaken by those barges I've described, the 550 10-ton barges. So it was boat traffic primarily, but also the floating bridge. The Irrawaddy, by the way, was never bridged. It was all of the traffic was undertaken by riverboats.
Oh, okay.
It was just the Chindwin that was bridged.
Oh, there you go. Despite all of Slim's success, when he came under the command of Oliver Lees, he was nearly sacked. What happened there?
Well, he was sacked, actually. The real challenge here was that Lees, who was not a particularly impressive commander of the 8th Army in Italy, a place was needed for him. And General Sir George Giffard, who was the Slim's commander in Burma until late 1944, was retired. He was an older gentleman, General Sir George Giffard, commander of the 11th Army Group, and Oliver Lees came out to become Mountbatten's primary military commander and a revamped structure called Allied Land Forces Southeast Asia. He came out, as Slim described in Defeat and Victory, with sand in his shoes. He came out as a successful commander of the 8th Army after Monte in Italy. Now, there's lots of debate about how successful he was, but that he had command of the 8th Army, big job, and he came out with the idea of commanding the armies in Southeast Asia without realizing or recognizing at any stage that the entire conception for victory in the Far East was Slim, that Slim had been building up the idea of progressively the idea that the Japanese could be defeated doctrinally and practically from 1942. The entire origins and basis of success in 1944 and 45 had begun way back in 1942 by Slim. Without Slim, none of this would have happened. Lees didn't understand any of this. He came into the fray with the natural arrogance of his class and with the 8th Army experience behind him and said, I'm in charge. And the two fell out. There's no doubt about it. The two men fell out. And Lees wangled with Mountbatten. Mountbatten showed unusual weakness here in giving way to Lees. Lees persuaded Mountbatten that Slim was tired and needed a break. And so Mountbatten sent a message back to London to Alanbrooke, who was the Chief of the Imperial General Staff, saying that a new army commander was required to replace Lees. Now, Alanbrooke didn't know a huge amount about what was going on in the Far East. He was just party to the regular reports that came back from Mountbatten and others. But he was smart enough to realize this was a serious mistake. You don't swap horses midstream. And he was also smart enough to realize that the great victories in Imphal and Kohima in 1944 were Slim's. And he was smart enough also to recognize that the transformation of everything that was going on out there wasn't down to Mountbatten, who had arrived in October 1943, but had been caused by Slim. And he had been well briefed by others who knew this. And he immediately sent a message back to Mountbatten saying, stop this nonsense now. Sack Lees and put Slim in his place. And that's exactly what happened. Lees tried to sack Slim. Alanbrooke refused to accept it and told Mountbatten to sack Lees, and Lees was sacked, and Slim became Allied Land Forces Commander of Southeast Asia. Quite an extraordinary turnaround. Not the first time he had been sacked. In 1942, General Noel Irwin, who's the commander of the Eastern Army and quite a nasty piece of work, frankly, also tried to sack Slim for something that Slim had no responsibility for, which was the operations in Arakan in 1942-43. And that also was overturned by Wavell, and Noel Irwin was sacked, and Slim was made commander of the Eastern Army, which became, ultimately in August 1944, the 14th Army. So Slim was sacked twice by men who were nowhere near his caliber. It's a very interesting side story to the story of the war. In Australia, of course, you had a whole series of similar shenanigans which went on during the war, all the product of a clash of egos between men, frankly, who weren't capable of commanding to the degree and the level that was needful. And I'm afraid that's a classic story of commanders in war. People who are often just not good enough themselves try to sack those that are good, try to get rid of them for their own personal advancement. And it's not a pretty sight. Fortunately, in Slim's case, Auchinleck just didn't know him at all. He might have met him once or twice at Staff College in the 1920s, but didn't know him otherwise. recognized a good thing when he saw it.
And it was a good thing that he did.
Exactly.
So part of Slim's success was the headquarters that he built, that he trained. He did have the luxury of being able to pick some people who were very talented and who he had worked with and had a close relationship with him. They also did a lot of shoots. What else do we know about the way that he trained and led his headquarters?
It was a very collusive headquarters, a very collusive approach. He wasn't hierarchical in any sense. The way in which the headquarters can best be described is as a good common room. And I've had someone describe that to me as such. It was a very friendly group of professionals working together to solve the problems that they were faced. They were a bunch of friends as well. Many of the people he found himself with in the 14th Army, he had served with and at various levels and degrees in the 14th Army. And through the years, when I started interviewing veterans of the 14th Army in 1999, almost all of them, to a man, said this to me. We felt that we were part of a family, and we were part of Slim's family. His adjutant at one stage, was his MA rather, who I interviewed about that time, said we'd all regarded ourselves as part of the Slim family, that this wasn't about a military hierarchy. This is about a really unique team brought together to solve one problem, which is the Japanese in Burma. And we were all fixated on doing what was necessary to achieve our aim in this regard.
So how would you really sum up his command philosophy then?
Well, the command philosophy, he very famously at Sandos after the war said that leadership is just plain you. And I think that's really, really critical. You're not a leader simply because you wear the rank or because you've done a particular course or you've read a book. You have to be a leader if you are attractive to followers. And I think this is something that I've put in my books about Slim as well. People were attracted to Slim. They liked becoming a follower of Slim. And I've always suggested that really to be a leader, you need to have acquiescent or volunteer followers. People need to want to follow you, not out of some prurient interest in what you might do next, but because they believe in you. That's the key thing. Slim enabled people to believe in him because of the strength and robustness of his character, the strength and robustness of his plans, his ability to communicate intelligently with people. There's a very, very famous occasion, and he was very well known for this. In December 1944, he went and he spent a lot of his time talking to his Indian soldiers. I mean, 3 or 4 times a week, he would be talking to soldiers in Urdu, Gurkhali, or Hindustani. And there's a very famous occasion I discovered a few years back when, in December 1943, he was standing on the banks of the Chindwin in India with a newly raised Indian Army battalion. And these guys spoke a mixture of Hindi and Urdu, and I had never seen the army commander before. And he got up in front of them, and this is from the recollections of an officer who was there, and he said, I'm going to tell you what's going to happen. In 3 months' time, the Japanese are going to cross this river, and they're going to invade India. Well, what are we going to do? What are you going to do? We're going to withdraw into the hills. We're going to move back to the west of the Infel Plain. We're going to allow the Japanese to become stretched out and vulnerable. We're then going to attack them. You're going to attack them. Very briefly, why is this important? It's important because he took the ordinary Indian soldiers speaking in Hindi and Urdu into his confidence. They all knew that when the Japanese came, and when the Japanese did come, they all knew this. And there's a lot of references to this. They knew that what the Japanese were going to do, and they knew what their plan was, and they knew their part in it, which was to stand firm and to fight back and to allow the Japanese to be stretched out. For a general, a commander of an army as large as the 14th Army, to make sure that every single ordinary soldier knew what his plan was really quite, and to take them into his confidence, to trust them. Now, of course, there was no way that they were going to go and tell the Japanese, but that was a risk he had to take. It's actually about making sure that every cog in your army is completely bought into your vision and trust you as the ultimate leader. And even if perhaps those individual soldiers didn't trust their platoon commanders or their company commanders or their commanding officers, they trusted Slim because he was Chacha Slim Sahib. He was Uncle Bill. These are Indian soldiers regarding the commander of their, and calling the army commander Uncle Bill. This wasn't British soldiers. This is Indian soldiers. And this is a really important piece, I think, that people often forget. They just don't understand that the ordinary Indian soldier from across India, recruited from India, regarded Bill Slim as Uncle Bill. It didn't come after the war. They were talking about Chacha, Slim Saab, during the war. So this really dramatic confidence in this. It's not fair also to say Slim was godlike, because he wasn't. He was a very down-to-earth, practical, even phlegmatic man. But he was able to exude a degree of confidence that's really, really important in senior officers. And actually, as we both know, senior officers often don't do, or they try to create by artifice, a very natural relationship with men who were very happy to go to war and go into battle and to sacrifice their lives because they knew that Slim was their commander.
What do you think the lessons are for officers that they can take from Field Marshal Slim?
Oh, there are so many of them. I think the first thing is be yourself. It's really, really critical that your leadership and we're all different leaders, we all exhibit leadership in different ways, is a reflection of who you are as a character. Don't try and be someone that you're not. It's really important that you, particularly as a young officer, be yourself, be professional, be committed, but don't try and be someone you're not. Be practical. Slim was ultimately practical. Read around your profession. Slim was a reader. He was also a writer. He wrote a large number of articles in the 1930s under a pseudonym. I ended up editing them and publishing them last year, and they were published in newspapers and magazines. Read around your profession, understand the profession, think up. Slim was a great proponent of the idea of, every soldier has a field marshal's bat in the knapsack. That was Bob's Roberts. But, you as a soldier, as a young platoon commander, you need to understand exactly what it is that your division and your corps commanders are doing and what they're trying to do. When I was a young officer in Germany in the 1980s, we were defending, our defensive plan was defeat operational maneuver groups of the 3rd Shock Army. I absolutely knew what North Ag Commander's plan was as a young second lieutenant commanding a Milan platoon. And it all made perfect sense to me. As a young officer, an officer at every rank, you need to have a full conception of where you sit in the hierarchy of command, from grand strategic at one end to the tactical at the other. Understand what you're doing and what part you play. That's critically important. So it's about having open eyes and open ears and understanding your profession in an intelligent and a nuanced way. And then also try to give your soldiers the tools to do the same. There's no point you being that jewel in the crown if no one else around you understands what you're attempting to do. I've seen in my career officers who fall into that category, and of course they're less capable than they could be, because they're not training up their own troops to do the same and to think the same. When I first joined my battalion in Germany a long time ago, I was taken under the wing of a man who is a very, very strong friend of mine now. He retired from the army as a brigadier, but he got me to read a particular book. It was quite an extraordinary book, and he recognized, this man, that I had something that I didn't recognize in myself, and he encouraged and nurtured that from a very early day. In my mid-career, I spent a lot of time talking to commanding officers about the importance of them and nurturing their own young officers, all the way from subaltern up to field officer rank, and encouraging them to read, to attend courses, to take the profession of arms seriously, because if they did so, then they would, everyone around them would benefit.
What was the book that he recommended to you?
And We Shall Shock Them by General Sir David Fraser, which is the story of the recovery of the British Army in the Second World War. It's a really remarkable book. General Sir David Fraser, quite a remarkable soldier. When General Sir Richard Dannett and I, or Lord Dannett, in fact, sat down to write our book, Victory to Defeat, in the start of COVID 2020, we wanted to write a book that preceded And We Shall Shock Them. So our book is set up to tell the story of the British Army before 1940. General Sir David Fraser's book takes it from 1940 through to 1945.
Outstanding.
Well, it was an extraordinary book, and I would encourage, if anyone wants to understand how the British Army was transformed through the Second World War, our book's the depressing one. It takes us through some very depressing decades of the 1920s. But the British Army rebuilding itself and rebuilding its confidence is really, really critical. And it's a great, great book, still available online.
I'll have to have a look for it. The depressing book, though, is probably more relevant to our times, though.
Yes, very much so. I think Defeat into Victory, Richard and I started writing it before the attack on Ukraine on the 22nd of February 2022. But we were profoundly depressed by a process which had begun in about 2010 in the British Army of downgrading the army from an organisation that could fight a high-intensive campaign against a peer adversary to an army that would struggle to maintain a counterinsurgency footprint. Our concern is that as soon as you lose the capability of fighting at a high intense level against a peer adversity, you'll never recover it until the metal starts to fly again, because counterinsurgency armies are effectively gendarmeries. They have a very, very different purpose and a different focus. A high-intensely trained army, i.e. an army trained to fight a high-intensity combined arms war against a peer adversary, can switch its gaze and fight coin if appropriately prepared and trained, and then switch back. But once you lose that capability, you've lost it forever. We haven't got there finally in the British Army, fortunately, but we were close to losing it. And we set out to write our book, The Victory to Defeat, British Army 1918 to 1940, so a shameless plug here, James, in order to be able to describe the process by which the country and the army itself lost that capability.
A shameless plug for a book which everyone should read. It's a fantastic book.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for this. It's been fantastic. I think there's so much wisdom that you've distilled out of the incredible career of Slim. So many great lessons.
Thank you very much, James. As ever, it's a pleasure to be with you, and I look forward to seeing the results of young officers across the army rising to the challenge. I mean, every generation has its own challenges. I think the point about Slim is he was able to meet those of his age because he was intellectually and physically disposed to do so. He had that inquiring mind and approach to life which enabled him to solve problems. They're the sort of people we need in the army today.
Thank you very much, Dr. Robert Lyman, for your time and your expertise in bringing out the lessons that we can learn from the career of Field Marshal Sir William Slim. For me, there are 6 key lessons that I've tried to bring out in the last 3 episodes. Firstly, everyone needs to have a commitment to their own professional development and their own professional military education. Slim was only promoted to Provisional Lieutenant Colonel on the 2nd of May 1938. Before that, he was a Brevet Lieutenant Colonel, so effectively his substantive rank was still Major. In 1943, he was a Lieutenant General. He'd gone from commanding a battalion and wheeling and dealing companies to being a Lieutenant General, commanding an army and wheeling and dealing corps, and he'd done that in 5 short years. He'd moved from the tactical level all the way up to the level of grand strategy, operating at the political level. It was critical that he understood his place in the Second World War because he was operating at the theatre level. Secondly, optimism. Optimism in the face of an overwhelmingly pessimistic operational situation. He writes in his book how humbled he felt after his soldiers had withdrawn 1,000 miles in 100 days, and yet they marched out as a formed body, they marched out with their weapons, and they marched out with their morale. They did that, though, because Slim maintained an incredible sense of optimism, and that filtered out throughout all of the corps that he was commanding at the time. That feeds into the basic lessons in leadership that come from Slim and the way that he conducted himself, the way that he took leadership to be a very personal thing. He couldn't fake it. He had to be genuine with all of the soldiers that he commanded. In 1945, the 14th Army had around 1 million soldiers in it. It was the largest army in the world. Slim would have only seen a small fraction of those soldiers, and yet universally he was revered as Uncle Bill. That was because of his leadership style, which he permeated throughout the organisation. He cared for all of his soldiers, and he ensured that his corps commanders and divisional commanders treated their soldiers in exactly the same way. He was a strong innovator in medical evacuation by air so that his troops would be able to get the best treatment possible if they were wounded. That made a really big impact on the soldiers. They felt cared for, and they went that extra mile for Slim time and time again because of it. Fourth, his commitment to lessons learned and doctrine development. He took a corps that had marched out of Burma, sat down, went back to the basics and looked at how the Japanese fought, how they could be defeated in the jungle. Lessons learnt were captured, they were assimilated, doctrine was developed, and then the soldiers were trained in that doctrine. A huge commitment to the training of the soldiers. I was surprised to learn that many of the soldiers, when they entered the army, were trained for 9 months. That's an incredible commitment. Fifth, his understanding of operational art. I think the twin battles of Imphal and Kohima, where he accepts decisive engagement because he knows the way that the Japanese fight, more importantly, the way that the Japanese think, and he understands the effect that the terrain is going to have on his logistics trail. He has envisaged what those battles are going to look like. Now, it was a near-run thing, but those twin victories set the conditions for the advance into Burma in 44 and 45. That is, I think, a great example of operational art, which is the skillful employment of military forces to attain strategic goals through campaigns and major operations. It is a cognitive approach reflecting experience, creativity, intuition, and judgment. Slim had all of those 4 elements in his design for the campaign. And the last one was his approach to innovation. As a commander, it is your job to enforce your will on the enemy. And Slim was able to do that. He was able to enforce his will upon the Japanese. Now, if you studied the Japanese in the Second World War for anything more than 2 minutes, you'll understand that enforcing your will on a Japanese opponent was generally quite difficult. Slim did this time and time and time again. But that wouldn't have been enough for Slim because he didn't have the resources that he required to do that. This is where innovation comes in. Many of his problems were logistics. He didn't have the ability to move supplies around the theatre. So he developed his own navy. He developed techniques for air transport. Not only was that innovative, but of course you need airfields to be able to do that, and it is very wet in Burma. So his army created techniques for the construction of airfields that would be able to operate with the monsoonal rains. A similar problem existed with roads. Roads would just wash away under the monsoonal rain. This is where the concept of bites came into play, where bitumen would be soaked into hessian to enable the roads to be more robust. Crossing the Chindwin and Irrawaddy rivers, 2 mighty rivers which represented significant barriers to movement. The ability of his engineers to build a bridge in a place where the Japanese didn't think it was possible allowed him to get an operational advantage over the Japanese and speed their withdrawal. There is definitely a lot to learn from Slim. So if you haven't read his book, Defeat into Victory, I would highly recommend that. Also, Robert's book, Slim, the Master of War, that really places it in perspective just how exceptional he was as a commander. The other book of Roberts that I would definitely recommend is The Generals, From Defeat to Victory, Leadership in Asia, 1941 to 45. He looks at a range of generals, including Percival, Mountbatten, Mutaguchi, Yamashita, so you can get to see a flavour of what worked and also what didn't work in the Far East theatre. So we'll leave it there until next week. Please like and subscribe to the show wherever you've seen it. And if you see us come up in any of the socials, please like and share those. And I also really like hearing how you're using the podcast in your PME programs.
The Principles of War podcast is brought to you by James Ealing. The show notes for the Principles of War podcast are available at www.theprinciplesofwar.com for maps, photos and other information that didn't make it into the podcast. Follow us on Facebook or tweet us at Surprise Podcast. If you've enjoyed this podcast, please leave a review on iTunes and tag a mate in on one of our episodes. All opinions expressed by individuals are those of those individuals and not of any organisation.